I'm Scott L. Miller. Welcome back to Sam IT, and today let's talk about why we always talk about separating services on your servers. This one goes back really long way and has existed more or less since we could afford to have lots of computers, so not the 1960s. In IT, it is generally considered favorable, not technically a best practice, but pretty good one, that we want to keep different services or workloads separate from each other. Now, what do we mean by services and workloads? Well, things like your web server, your application server, your database server, your Active Directory server, your file server, all of these represent different workloads. They may have separate processes that need to work together to do what they do. We often would combine those together. We're not trying to be super extreme here. It's not like every single individual thread needs to be in its own VM or something, but we do want to isolate at least general workloads in some meaningful way. So there's a certain amount of just skill and common sense to apply here. Apply some knowledge of how the systems work together, and sometimes we do different things, such as we're building a LAMP server. LAMP, for those who don't know, is Linux, Apache, MySQL or MariaDB, and PHP. It's a common set of tools used together to make light web applications. You might know some websites running on WordPress. This is how it's often done. When working with something like LAMP, we of course have the option of running the front-end application server, that's the PHP, which runs inside Apache on top of Linux, on its own server or VM. And we have the option of separating out the database, MySQL, onto its own VM. Or we could put them together. Technically, by the law of separation, we would never want to put them together, but the law of separation doesn't say always do it, it just says lean towards it unless it really makes sense to put them together. And in the case of LAMP, quite often, it makes sense to put them together. We often deploy one database for one application workload, and they are tightly coupled together, and the benefits of keeping them together outweigh separating them out. So, I don't want to give the impression that this is a best practice and that you're crazy to never put things together. Likewise, almost always a domain controller for Active Directory will actually have the Active Directory service and a DNS, and often DHCP, lumped together on one system. Could you separate them? Yes, absolutely. And some people do. And in a giant company like a Fortune 100, you'd expect them to do so. But in a normal company, say even 50,000 people or fewer, you're probably going to find them all put together because they're kind of complementary and they don't conflict with each other. And they're designed to be put together really easily, so they're tested very heavily. But in general, why do we keep things separate? We can see lots of reasons to put things together. You need fewer operating system instances, there's less to manage, it might cost less. Why would we separate them? Well, the reason that we separate most things, general things, is because we want to isolate interactions on one hand and we want to give flexibility on the other. Let's break these apart. Interactions. Let's say you have two things that are not tightly coupled. So ignore the LAMP scenario, but let's talk about your domain controller, and let's say you're going to put on a third-party application for monitoring your servers. Putting these on the same box has some risks because these two things are not tested together, they're not working together, they don't depend on each other, but they may conflict, whether in resources or in what library versions need to be installed, or maybe there's actually a bug in one of them that messes with the other and causes corruption. All kinds of bad things could happen, and we don't like bad things in servers, right? No. So keeping things separate helps us isolate faults, whether it's a system actually crashing or just getting slow or having some weird behavior that's hard to isolate. By keeping them separate, it's much easier for us to troubleshoot. We can reboot them whenever we need and things like that. Now, the isolation piece as far as how we treat them. It may be that your domain controllers need to be up 24/7, but they're a cluster, so any individual one can be rebooted at any time, even in the middle of the working day. That's great, but what if you had running on it something else that was like really important? Let's just say Microsoft SQL Server instance that sits behind your most important critical financial application, and it's used all day, every day, and it cannot go down. This would be a disaster. What if something happens and you need to reboot your domain controller just for normal maintenance, or you need to patch the system for security reasons? Now you can't reboot because this SQL server can't go down. That's potentially a problem. If you'd have kept them separate, you could easily reboot workloads and patch workloads as needed for their own needs and not have to worry about how that will impact other workloads that they're tightly coupled to for no reason. So that's typically why we separate. On one hand, it gives us the protection of things not messing with each other on the code or system basis, and that does happen more often than you think. Things simply have conflicting requirements or are not prepared for the other thing to be there, and they mistreat the system with each other. And on the other hand, we want an isolation so that we can maintain the different systems in isolation so we can meet the needs of each one as best for its workload and not have to apply a common denominator of all shared workloads in order to maintain one of them. So it helps with security, performance, lowers the overhead of management, and things like that. That's why we keep things separated. Of course, we have to look at things like cost. Maybe you have to pay for each of your instances, such as if you're running Windows servers and you don't have data center licenses, and that may encourage you to find some workloads that do fit pretty well together and merge them where it makes sense. And that's acceptable, but it's important to make sure we're thinking these things through and not doing it haphazardly. If you don't know, you want to lean towards separation. And if you're using an operating system that's free, such as one of the Linux family of operating systems or FreeBSD, then you're going to want to be heavily isolated almost all of the time. If you're using Windows, you're going to want to be a little bit more strategic, unless, of course, you have data center licensing, and then you can lean back towards the heavy isolation again. But you definitely want to lean towards separation. And even in a really small business, you're generally going to want to have to separate some of your workloads, even if not all of them. But some things, like your LAMP server or your Active Directory domain controllers, will have some amount of merging, even in a pretty extremely separated environment. Thanks for joining me again. Remember to like and subscribe. And, as always, you can sponsor us on Patreon. And, of course, continue the discussion in the comments below. Ask about how you're separating. Tell us where you have separated, where you've been burned by not separating, where it's caused cost problems by having separated too much. Be a great discussion to have. Talkadillo is a cloud-hosted or fully managed on-premises IP PBX platform providing businesses with simple and simply affordable voice communications. Visit Talkadillo.com and learn more about how Talkadillo can change how you view your telephones and help to support Sam IT.